People often hear that Hinduism has 330 million gods, and at first it sounds poetic, like a symbol of diversity or divine abundance. But when you start to think about it logically, the number alone tells a story of confusion, contradiction, and human invention more than it does about truth or divinity. Let's start with the number itself, 330 million. It's said that every river, mountain, tree, and even emotion has its own god, a god of wealth, of knowledge, of war, of sleep, of rain, of hunger, of luck, and even of mischief. But if you try to picture what that actually means, 330 million distinct divine beings, each supposedly conscious, each with power, each with their own stories and personalities, the absurdity starts to show. It's not divine order, it's chaos disguised as spirituality. If someone told you there were 330 million presidents running one country, each with their own agenda, you'd instantly see the problem. Laws would collapse, decisions would contradict, and nobody would know who's really in charge. Now apply that logic to gods, each supposedly responsible for some cosmic or earthly domain. Who governs whom? Who enforces what? When two gods' interests clash, whose will prevails? The concept of 330 million gods didn't come from divine revelation. It came from human imagination trying to fill in every unexplained gap in life. Ancient people saw lightning. They thought that must be a god. They saw rivers flooding, another god. They felt love, anger, or fear. Surely gods of emotion too. With every mystery, another divine name was added to the list. But instead of simplifying reality, it made it more fragmented. It created a universe where the divine was multiplied endlessly to fit every human experience. And that reveals something deeper about human psychology. When we don't understand something, we tend to invent meaning to control the fear of uncertainty. Now, some might argue that the 330 million figure is symbolic, that it's not literal, that it represents the infinite manifestations of one ultimate divine energy. But that argument itself only highlights the problem. If it's all just symbolic, then the number means nothing. And if it's literal, it's absurd. Either way, the belief collapses under its own contradictions. And if it's all one divine essence appearing in many forms, then why the need for specific names, rituals, temples, and festivals for each one? Why carve 1,000 statues of different gods if they're all the same? You don't worship one ocean by building 330 million ponds. The truth is that the idea of countless gods served a social purpose. In early societies, tribes and regions wanted their own local deities. Having your own god meant identity, pride, and control. Priests and rulers could use their regional gods to justify power. So religion became decentralized. Every group, every caste, every region, every profession had its patron deity. And soon enough, India became a marketplace of gods. This isn't evidence of divine diversity. It's evidence of human fragmentation. If divinity were real and universal, wouldn't truth converge rather than splinter endlessly? Wouldn't reality move toward unity instead of multiplying into hundreds of millions of versions of itself? Think about this. If there are supposedly 330 million gods, how do you choose which one to pray to? Do you need a god for each mood or each problem? Do you risk offending another by choosing wrongly? What happens when two gods have opposing demands? You quickly realize the whole system functions less like a coherent truth and more like an ancient bureaucracy, endless names, titles, and hierarchies serving no clear purpose beyond sustaining themselves. And this is where human psychology quietly steps in again. Religion works when it feels personal. People want a god who listens, who seems close, who shares their local language or culture. That emotional need created the inflation of gods. Every village made their own version. Every family had a guardian spirit. Every occupation developed a patron deity. In other words, gods multiplied for the same reason myths did, to give comfort, not truth. The 330 million figure might sound excessive, but it's really just a reflection of how humans endlessly personalize their beliefs. If you zoom out, you see the same pattern everywhere. The ancient Greeks had their pantheon, the Romans too, the Egyptians, the Norse, the Mayans, all had many gods, each one born from some natural event or human trait. The difference is that most of those religions faded with time. Hinduism just kept absorbing and rebranding its deities until the number grew astronomical. When beliefs evolve that way, they stop being divine revelations and start looking more like cultural accumulation. Layers of mythology built on top of older layers. Gods merged, split, got renamed, reimagined or localized. Some gods were recycled into others. Old tribal gods became avatars of newer ones. New deities were created by blending stories. This isn't a heavenly system. It's mythology that never cleaned up after itself. And if we treat mythology as cultural history, that's fine. It's art, it's storytelling. But when people treat it as literal truth, it stops being poetic and starts being irrational. Believing in 330 million real gods today is like believing every cartoon character ever drawn actually exists somewhere in the universe. The more you analyze it, the more it reveals the fingerprints of human minds, not divine minds. Human imagination loves multiplication. It loves variety, personality, drama, and that's exactly what the pantheon of gods provides, a cosmic soap opera reflecting human life. Jealousy, romance, revenge, betrayal, divine stories that mirror our own psychology more than they reveal any ultimate truth. Some might say, well, it's not meant to be taken literally, it's philosophical, that each god represents a concept like love, strength, wisdom, or destruction. But even that doesn't save the idea. If gods are just symbols of human traits, then we're simply worshipping our own nature under different names. It's self-admiration wrapped in ritual. It's fascinating how people who reject the idea of one invisible God still accept thousands of visible ones, each sculpted by human hands. A stone idol carved by a person is then treated as eternal, sacred, and powerful. Yet it cannot move, speak, or think. If that's divine, what isn't? And that's the paradox. When everything can be called divine, divinity loses meaning altogether. When you multiply gods to explain every corner of existence, you dilute the concept until it explains nothing. The story of 330 million gods tells us more about human insecurity than cosmic truth. It shows how people fill the gaps of understanding with comfort and color, how fear of the unknown drives imagination into overdrive, and how repetition over centuries turns imagination into belief. What's even more interesting is how such beliefs persist in modern times. In an age of science, space travel, and quantum physics, millions still pray to different gods for different needs. A god for exams, a god for rain, a god for wealth, a god for health, a god for removing obstacles. It's like outsourcing every aspect of life to a different supernatural department. And yet for all this divine specialization, nothing changes. Droughts still happen, diseases still spread, poverty still exists. If there truly were 230 million gods managing the world, shouldn't at least one of them have fixed something by now? This is where the logic completely breaks down. Believers often explain away failure with excuses, saying the gods have their own plan, or faith must be tested. But these are not explanations, they're defenses against disappointment. When a belief fails to predict, explain, or deliver consistent results, it fails the test of truth. Even the idea of having so many gods contradicts itself internally. If one god is all-powerful, the others are unnecessary. If none are all-powerful, then what makes any of them divine? And that's the quiet irony. The moment you accept one god as supreme, the rest become irrelevant. And the moment you accept all as equal, none are supreme. It's a paradox that dissolves under its own logic. The sheer number of gods is not a sign of richness, it's a sign of inflation, like a currency losing value because too much of it is printed. When you create gods for everything, you end up with gods for nothing. Throughout history, the multiplication of deities shows exactly how human societies evolved, not toward truth, but toward complexity. The more fragmented societies became, the more gods they needed to hold them together. And as new cultures merged, instead of erasing old gods, they added new ones to keep the peace. It's diplomacy, not divinity. And that's why the 330 million number still persists. It serves as a cultural umbrella, large enough to include everyone, regardless of their background or belief. It's politically convenient, spiritually vague, and psychologically comforting, but not intellectually consistent. If we truly want to understand the world, multiplying gods doesn't help. Reducing superstition does. The more we look at nature, science, and human behavior, the clearer it becomes that we don't need millions of invisible overseers to explain reality. We need curiosity, evidence, and reason. Think about the difference. In religion, answers come first and questions are discouraged. In reason, questions come first, and answers must earn their place. One leads to understanding, the other to repetition. When we step back and see the 330 million gods, not as a divine truth, but as a mirror of human imagination, the story becomes clearer. It's the record of a civilization trying to make sense of the world without science, a world where myths filled every unknown space, and once those myths became tradition, they stopped being questioned. But the beauty of the human mind is that it can question its own creations, and when it does, the illusions begin to fade. Whether it's 330 million gods or one, the same question always applies. Where is the evidence? Belief without proof is just repetition with confidence. When you strip away the stories, rituals, and fear, what remains is the same human impulse that created every god in history, the need to feel control in an uncontrollable world. And that's understandable, but it's not truth. The absurdity of 330 million gods isn't about the number, it's about what the number represents. The human tendency to multiply fantasy until it feels real, to turn imagination into authority, and to call that authority sacred. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. You realize that gods don't multiply because reality demands it. They multiply because imagination does. And that simplicity is what makes truth powerful. When something is true, it doesn't need endless variations to make sense. It holds up on its own. You can test it, question it, and it still stands. But when something is fragile, it needs layers of stories, rituals, and interpretations to protect it from scrutiny. That's exactly what happened with the concept of 330 million gods. It became so inflated that no one could even begin to question it coherently. If someone asked, "Where did this number come from?" the answer would depend on whom you ask. Some say it's symbolic, others say it's literal, some even argue it's a mistranslation. And that's the sign of a belief trying to survive by bending in every direction at once. Truth doesn't need flexibility like that, only myths do. Interestingly, when you trace this idea back through ancient language, you find that it probably didn't even mean 330 million in the modern sense. It likely came from an old term meaning 33 classes or 33 categories of deities. Over time, a shifting word also came to mean crore, or 10 million, and through that linguistic slide, a modest pantheon swelled into an incomprehensible crowd, a single ambiguity inflated into sacred arithmetic. That one shift tells you everything. One misunderstood word turned a simple pantheon into an uncountable swarm. People kept repeating it, passing it down until it sounded too grand to question. That's not revelation. That's a game of telephone with temples at every stop. And even when the original meaning is explained, the larger number lingers, because exaggeration feels magical. The bigger the number, the safer the doctrine. It's beyond comprehension, they say. But if it's beyond comprehension, who gets to claim to understand what it wants, what it forbids, and how it must be worshipped? This contradiction sits at the core of belief systems built on quantity rather than clarity. When faith depends on how many gods, rituals, or temples exist, it drifts into theater. It becomes about the appearance of devotion rather than the pursuit of understanding. Now, think in human terms. 330 million gods means more deities than there are species of animals. It means, in theory, a god for every blade of grass and still a surplus. Numbers so swollen they stop meaning anything, and yet the scale itself is offered as proof, as if size can substitute for substance. The mind loves big numbers in religion because infinity feels safer than uncertainty. Say one god, and people question its fairness. Say countless gods, and people stop asking. It's too vast to challenge. Infinity becomes a shield for ignorance. But look closely at those gods, and you see people jealous, angry, partial, proud, needing offerings, praising flattery, punishing neglect. Why would transcendent beings crave validation from the very creatures they supposedly made? Study mythology, and you see the mirror. The god of war is human violence with a crown. The god of wealth is human greed with a halo. The goddess of fertility is human survival, romanticized and ritualized. Multiply the needs, multiply the fears, multiply the deities, a catalogue of anxieties presented as a map of heaven. So when you end up with 330 million, it's not abundance, it's inventory, not revelation, but record-keeping of human hope and worry. Religions protect this. Inflation by wrapping it in the language of mystery and unity. One manifests as many, they say, but if many can be anything, then divine can be everything. And when everything is divine, nothing is. Divinity drains into the floorboards of everyday objects until the word loses weight. You can see the consequences. Coconut breaking for luck while hunger persists, milk poured over stone while children go without, ritual spending sprees to fix fate while causes and effects remain untouched. When prayers work, they're proof. When they don't, it's fate. Beliefs survive because they're never allowed to fail, unfalsifiable, unaccountable, and emotionally self-funding. Strip it all down, and the world still turns on stable laws. Gravity doesn't appeal for worship. Viruses don't negotiate with incense. Rain follows physics, not a prayer calendar. Knowledge, not ritual, is what has cured, built, connected. Humans aren't rational by default. We're comfort-seeking first, rational second. It's easier to accept an elaborate story than accept I don't know. But I don't know is the only doorway to now I understand. That's why questioning matters, because it separates what's real from what's repeated. If truth scaled with believers, the largest pantheon would win. But truth doesn't care how many hands are raised. It stands or falls on evidence. And there isn't any, not for one, and certainly not for hundreds of millions. What we do see are statues, festivals, stories, and hierarchies, human-made and culture-shaped. The same template shows up in Olympus, Asgard, and along the Nile. Different names, same instincts, explain with narrative when we could investigate with method. But stories can be demoted from authorities to artifacts. They can be appreciated without being obeyed. The tools that once invented gods, imagination and fear, can be replaced with better tools, curiosity and evidence. Morality doesn't need permission slips from heaven. It needs an honest accounting of consequences. Purpose doesn't require a divine job description. It grows from building, helping, understanding. Fulfillment doesn't thrive on ritual. It thrives on discovery and connection. Once you peel mythology away, reality is more elegant than any story told about it. Stars shine without hymns. Rivers carve valleys without blessings. Life begins when conditions click into place, not when a deity clocks in. That simplicity isn't cold, it's clean, and it's beautiful because it's honest. Belief is often marketed as depth, but depth is understanding, and understanding doesn't require 330 million parallel explanations for one reality. It requires one reality examined well. Treat every rock, tree, and river as a personality, and you shrink their wonder to human size. Treat them as themselves, and you open the door to geology, ecology, evolution, complexity without intention, balance without a planner. The miracle is not supernatural, it's natural, and it's everywhere for those who pay attention. If awe is the goal, look closer, not higher, to a cell dividing, to light bending, to memory flickering across synapses, miracles without altars,